do it for you, and I won't charge you too much of a loan. But then maybe 10 years from now, I'll own the road, I'll own that airport, and I'll own the people who work there. But right now, I need for my election to say, I built a road, I built an airport, and 4 years from now, I'll leave the country, so it's not my problem, it's you guys' problem. How do Pan-Africanists respond to this reality?
See, I think the first thing is, we're in Nigeria, which is the biggest economy in Africa. So even the concept that there is no money to invest in Nigeria, and there are no wealthy Nigerians, is a kind of interesting concept. So that is one question. Let's just take Nigeria as an example. Why is it that Nigeria's economy is in a state that it needs that kind of foreign investment? That to me is the first question that has to be addressed. How is it that it's got to such a state that it needs that? Why is it unable to develop on its own? If it continually is looking for foreign investment, it's always going to be in the same state. It's always going to be enslaved in one form or another. So I can't see how that can possibly be seen as a solution. The other thing is that the role of China in Africa, as well as other parts of the world, also has to be seen in the context of what people call the new scramble for Africa. So China is not just that China is acting alone, it's acting with the other BRICS, it's acting with the EU, or it's in contention with the EU, it's in contention even with the other BRICS, it's in contention with the US. So whatever angle the Chinese government takes is not only in its interest, but if you could say in rivalry with the interests of the other big powers. So those people who know their history or anything about history will know that the reason we talk about a new scramble is because there was an old scramble. So the old scramble ended with what? Old scramble ended with the First World War. Because when the contention between the big powers in Africa couldn't be advanced in any other way, and when the whole of Africa was already divided between the big powers, the only way they could resolve their differences was by going to war. And those who won the war then redivided Africa again and took the colonies of those who had lost the war. So in that sense, the scramble itself is extremely dangerous. It may not have got to that dangerous extent today, although we already see the consequences of it. That the big powers are fighting amongst themselves in a whole range of ways. They fight economically, they're fighting militarily, they're establishing their bases all over Africa. They have their troops all over Africa. They have their navies encircling Africa. They're presenting all kinds of so-called soft power. Sometimes it's loans, sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that, with 1,001 strings attached somewhere along the line. You know that if we take Britain as an example, just to give another example, in the British economy, we've gone through a period of so-called austerity where everything is cut. The only thing that isn't cut is overseas aid. The aid budget always is maintained or increases. Why is that? Is that because the British government is philanthropic and they have the interests of Africans and other people? No, it's not. Because that so-called aid they give is essentially a subsidy to their own multinational companies. They give you the subsidy and they say, privatize this. They give you the subsidy and they say, buy this. This is how these things work, and history shows all of this. There's no mystery about these things. So again, we have to understand how these things work and take the appropriate action, you could say, or at least discuss these things in this way. Because very often the governments of these countries act in a different way. They don't act in the interests of the country or the interests of the majority of people. So I think that those developments, including China, are very dangerous developments. The other thing, of course, is to look at the nature of China's economy. What is that all about? What's going on in China? What are their problems? And what are they trying to solve by doing what they're doing?
Sada, what do you think?
Well, I totally agree. I think in the beginning, I thought it was kind of refreshing or something. Like, they don't have colonial ties. It's kind of a clean, clean transaction. You get my resources, I build your road or whatever. But it's become much more complicated and much more problematic along the way because of the extent, but also because of not, it seems like there's a very clean, it's a clean-cut deal, but it's not, because China is building and has built. There are here in Nigeria as well, Confucius Institutes. They have imperialistic tendencies, and it's not getting a lot of attention. So it's not just we're looking for economic gain. They're also trying to, they're trying to infiltrate the minds as well. And actually the same goes for Turkey. Turkey also has these institutes everywhere. Who's clapping? Oh, nobody. Oh. So, so it's much more than just, or if you look at like the Horn of Africa, what's going on there's like a fight between Turkey and the Gulf, and, so we need to be really vigilant about all these different developments, and just because it's a different face, it doesn't mean it's a different structure. I keep coming back to that.
Yeah. So how do we respond to this in particular? Because in responding to these powers, they're called powers because they are powerful. And I read somewhere that there is no single African nation that is in a position to defend itself against an external aggressor. So if push comes to shove and you have to do it, a lot of countries feel, well, we have to do it because the alternative is we can't defend ourselves.
Do you mean military-wise?
Yes, militarily.
I don't think that's true, though. I mean, there's so many big armies in Africa that could, but they're divided, and they're being governed by foreign sovereignties. So Ethiopia used to be, called the police of the Horn for the longest time because they fought wars, proxy wars, wars in other countries, in Somalia, but then that was instructed by the Americans or instructed by the Europeans. So it's not that we don't have military organization. We do. But is that the road you want to go in? Or do you just want to change your economical system and think about what we can do together, and what can we do without, and also what can we do to use all the talent that we have around the globe and let them build those roads, let them lead all these great infrastructural projects. And I guess that's not really happening. Ghana now has called 2019 the year of return, and they're trying to repatriate, all types of Africans, maybe African American or people from the Caribbean. I guess you could call it like a big marketing stunt, or it's quite commercial, I guess. But in a way, it's a beginning. I don't know. I don't want to be like I was kind of skeptical about it, but I think I don't want to be too excited about it. No, I don't want to be too critical of it. Let's see what happens. At least something's moving, something's happening, something's being organized. I don't know.
I think the other thing is that we have a continental organization. So then the question is, what is that continental organization doing to defend the continent and its interests? So, and how do, even given its limitations and its weaknesses, how do we, or those of us who have the capability and the possibility, how do we try to ensure to actually strengthen the AU? It's a far from perfect, just as the OAU was far from perfect. But then there are occasions when the OAU acted as a continental organization, with regard to apartheid being the obvious example. So because it was recognized that that was a threat, and settler colonialism and other forms of colonialism were a threat to the entire continent. So, in fact, if you look at the creation of the AU, it was originally as a bulwark against neoliberal globalization. That was the intention. But then what happened, and it went down a different road. So it raises a question of how to strengthen that organization, or to demand of that organization that it acts in the interests of the continent, or to find ways to turn it into an instrument which at least can stand up and say these things. So these are also political questions that have to be discussed, and people, work out the solution to them. One can't just dismiss what exists. How can it be utilized? Or how can the people create something of their own, if that is what is required, to stand up on behalf of the continent?
Or how can we use the African Union, which is just basically a building? It's just a building. There's nothing else. It's sitting in Addis Ababa, but there's nothing real happening there to protect the interests of Africa and Africans. And recently, right now, actually, there's a conflict with an AU ambassador, a woman from Zimbabwe, I don't know if you heard this, who was fired because she said it's ridiculous that France is still so controlling the economies and the treasuries of most of their former colonies. And this is a very, very big problem, and she's right. And she got fired by the AU that is supposed to protect African interests. Now, this is the world upside down. Yeah. So you work for the AU, you're doing your job, and you get fired for doing your job. So, this is the situation we're in right now. The African Union, and I think not just the African Union, but African leaders do not respond to Africa or to Africans. They still respond to the former colonies. They respond to the IMF. They respond to the World Bank. You think you're choosing a leader for you, but that's not really true.
So we're almost out of time. So let's answer. Oh, we're out of time? Okay, so we're almost out of time. Let's just answer one question, which is in the title of this panel. So is Pan-Africanism then a fantasy? Is it something that is a practical reality that we could work towards and see? Or is it a fantasy, something that we could see the possibility of it happening at some point, but...
Are we answering this?
I think we should let Africans answer that.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah.
So that's the question we're throwing to you at the end of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, to answer the question, I want to bring our minds back to something the professor said, which is that the critical mass needs to unite, needs to become actively involved in developing the African nation. And as to the role of the African Union, I reflect on something that happened, in 2011, just to summarize. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was murdered on the streets of Libya, and it's being touted now, or that one of the possible reasons was that he was suggesting that Africa starts to trade its hydrocarbons for gold rather than the United States, dollar. And I just want to say that for us to get to the point where we're able to be self-sufficient, to compete with the rest of the global community on an equal plane where we don't need aid anymore, we do need to kind of take that stance collectively. We do need to define the terms of our association and of our trade particularly, because without money and without control of resources, then none of this will actually happen. And just finally, as a point to Sayad, the building, in fact, was built by Mike Adenuga, right, and is only being managed by the Alliance Française. So that's a positive.
I love that. Thank you.
Can I just say a word about that? Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. This is a very interesting example of a misunderstanding. We are here at a place which has been paid fully by the Nigerians. We are just here to have connection, thank you, between everyone, including the French speakers. I have here my friend from Djibouti, is a French speaker, you see. So, yes, it's a misunderstanding. And just to finish about that, Mike Edenuga is the president of Conoil, and Conoil is a Nigerian, also petrol. So, thank you for saying that. And last thing, in Addis Ababa, I'm Abesha also. I was in Addis, and Addis was Alliance Ethio-Française, and it was an Ethiopian center, just as he said.
I just want to know who's paying you, who's paying your salary.
Alors, very interesting. All the alliances in the world are local institutions.
No, who's paying your salary?
It's a Nigerian association.
No, okay, but who's paying your salary?
Me only. I am paid by the French government.
Aha,
Only.
thank you.
But Alliance Française de Lagos is a Nigerian association led by a Nigerian board who can sack me every day if he wants. I hope no.
But the next one will be paid by the French government as well.
We'll take one more comment from the gentleman right here, because our time is totally up. I mean, this is a conversation. We're still going to be in Alliance Française till tomorrow, right? We're still going to be here, so we could continue this conversation.
Of course we're still going to be here.
Okay, my name is Olatunji. I think the big elephant in the room is a global system that seems to perpetuate the economic disempowerment of the continent in itself. Because you find more and more numbers of Africans are drifting into extreme poverty. Year in, year out. And we have a population growth that also seems to be exceeding economic growth. And we have a near zero productive contribution to the global system. So I don't know, it just doesn't seem like there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I wanted to ask a question that how does a new Africa that is possible, how does it intersect with the contribution of the diaspora? Because there's an obvious brain drain happening right now. And so you have almost an empty intellectual environment within the continent.
I think that's a great question, and I will let Sada, because
I didn't really get the question, I'm sorry.
The question was kind of in two parts. One of it was the fact that it seems like there is a global structure to keep things the way they are, and to kind of disenfranchise African people. And at the same time, this system kind of filters away the best, draining away the best minds, the brain drain, the resource drain. So we have raw materials here. The resources are going elsewhere. We have talented minds, but they're headed out of the country, and the system is going down. And he's asking, so essentially, how do we change this? How do we turn this around? And I think in throwing that question here, I realized that we cannot possibly answer that question in the no time that we have. So what I would recommend is that immediately we get up from here, you grab a hold of Sada, you grab a hold of Professor Adi. Don't come to me. And
thank you for the question.
But can I just say very, very briefly, let's look at it the other way around. Okay, so Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa, for example. And we know that there are various people who have pocketed wealth and so on. So the question is, who creates all this wealth? So the creation of this wealth, it's not created by the people who steal it. It's not created by the government. It's created by people who work, people who produce things, people who farm. So the question is how those people who produce everything, who produce the oil, who produce the yam, who produce the groundnuts, who produce the or whatever, how those who produce all this wealth can take control of this wealth that they produce and use it for their own interests, so that we have all the things we need. We have a health system, we have education, we have electricity, we have water, we have all these things. It's as simple as that. The difficulty is that those who have their hands have developed a system to keep themselves in that position and to deny us the possibility of taking hold of what we have created and what is ours. So we have to find a way of preventing them from stopping us from taking what is ours. When we can find out how to do that, and history has provided us many examples, when we can empower ourselves and become decision makers, then we take hold of what is ours and we use it for our benefit. Then all these problems will be solved.
Thank you very much. Please let's give another round of applause to Professor Adi. A round of applause for Sada. And a round of applause for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Please put your hands together for the panelists.